So maybe it'd be helpful for some of the listeners before we really dive into the meat and potatoes of our conversation. Is just like, how do we understand the logos? What the logos is? I'm sure some of the listeners are familiar with John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And but what exactly does that mean to us? What is it? How do we understand that, and how that's going to relate to the conversation? So maybe if you want to say how you think of, or how you define, or even understand the logos, and then I'll try to put in my 2 cents or add to it.
Well, sounds good. I do think that starting with the Gospel of John, especially in a Christian context, is very helpful. But like you said, we don't want to limit it to just that specific word. We have to put it within a huge context. So in the Gospel of John, he begins with, "In the beginning was the Word." And the word that is being translated there is logos. But of course, that word has a huge philosophical history. And we don't have time really, and I don't have the expertise, of course, to really go into all the Greek philosophical understandings of the word logos. But what I can say is, when John uses it in the gospel, we have a plethora of definitions that we could use, a translation possibilities. And word is perhaps the weakest, maybe even the worst translation that we could use. Of course, dialogue or conversation would work. Of course, that Greek word can also be translated as reason, wisdom, rationality. And then, of course, one that's often overlooked but very important in Greek philosophy is something like organizing principle, or something that you use to make sense out of something. So I think this organizing or rational principle is another good way to think of logos. Then, of course, there's my favorite, which is, of course, logic. And so I think maybe realize the word logos. However, it's important to realize or remember that in the Gospel of John and Christianity, we're not talking about logic like the rule of the excluded middle, right, or the law of non-contradiction. That's not necessarily the kind of logic that we're talking about. We're talking about divine logic. We're talking about God's logic. We're talking about the logic that is produced from God, that is with God in the beginning. So it's not necessarily a 1 + 1 = 2 kind of logic, perhaps.
Although, so that's interesting because when I think about it, I like to think of logos as language, because I feel language then encapsulates the other adjectives we're using, as in logic and reason and all these things, because those things don't exist without language, and thought doesn't exist without language. So I'm actually fond of the use of word, because for me, word actually encapsulates those understandings. I'm, not that either way is right or wrong, but the way that I like to think about it is, like the word itself. We can't have reason, we can't have logic, we can't have dialogue without language. And what's the atomization of language? It's a single word, right? So, and I think the whole atomization back to Adam and Jesus being I think that this is just a common theme within the schematics of Christianity in general, is like trying to narrow down these hierarchies into these more specific things. But anyways, and then also the logos, even though a lot of the early church fathers understood it this way, they had different interpretations. And I know Psalm 33, I think 33:6 talks about how that God used the logos to create the heavens and the earth. And so then there's discussion in terms of Jesus being the logos, being the incarnation of the logos, but the logos already pre-existing the world itself, creation itself, the universe itself. And then you get into the theological understandings of well, the Logos and Jesus, so because these things are synonymous, is within God, but it's also a delineation, a differentiation of God as well. And I think, and then that's why I like language, because symbolically, we are all that same process is happening through all of us. We're taking non-physical, let's associate that symbolically with God, non-physical ideas, passions, expressions, and then we're emanating that into physical reality through vibratory sound waves. So it's becoming physical. And again, and so the incarnation itself is symbolic of the way that people use language. And then when what's becoming physical is logic and reason and these ideas and all these things. But that's a great start. And I just wanted to shout out a couple of these early church fathers, of like Ignatius of Antioch. So he was one of the first people to really articulate Jesus as the Logos. I mean, outside of the Gospel of John and Revelations and the Greek tradition, Stoicism, which I know that you know a little bit about. I mean, that's essential, again, in Logos theology within Christianity. I'm pretty fond of Justin Martyr. And the reason I am is because of his how he kind of widens the definition. So for him, Plato and Socrates, they're Christians not because they believed in in a historical literal interpretation or anything. It's that they were one with the Logos. They worshipped, again, this idea of logic and reason and the expression and through language. And then you have Theophilus of Antioch, who again understood Jesus as God, an eternal within God, but then begotten from creation. And then he understood the Holy Spirit as Sophia, and that comes in with these early church theologies, but also Gnosticism, because Gnosticism really tries to articulate this entity called Sophia. And so for him, he understood that as the Holy Spirit. You have Athenagoras of Athens, who was trying to defend Christianity against the attacks that they were atheistic. And the only reason that they claimed Christianity was atheistic is because they wouldn't worship the emperor and the Roman gods, right? And so he gives this whole spiel and presentation about how can we be atheists if we understand God the Father and God the Son, and the Son is the Logos. And then he uses Platonic and Stoic philosophy to articulate those things to everybody. And then Irenaeus, he like Justin Martyr understood essentially all the theophanies of the Old Testament and the New Testament as the Logos, which I think is really interesting because it gives a whole new conception to like the burning bush. Because from Irenaeus and Justin Martyr's perspective, that's Jesus. That's the Logos that's communing to Moses there in the burning bush. It's not necessarily Yahweh. But of course, Jews would have a very different interpretation of that. But do you have anything to say from that before we kind of dive into your work?
Oh man, there's tons of good material in there. One of the things you mentioned that I do think is worth pointing out that I think often gets missed because we do get so zoned in with this Logos theology, looking at the Greek philosophical precedents. And those are certainly important. I'm not downplaying those at all, but patristic scholarship, in my opinion, has really gotten so focused in on the philosophical precedents that we often miss the fact that in the Hebrew scriptures, being personified, and like you point out, not only do we see creation, the act of creation taking place within or through wisdom. Back in Psalms, we also in the Proverbs see wisdom itself being personified and showing up like an actual person, a woman crying out in the streets. So we have a lot of Jewish and Hebrew precedents for this understanding of God's logic, wisdom, or reason becoming a personality, becoming a person. And like you were saying, that person, of course, is then going to be taking something that is incorporeal and transforming it into something that is bodily. And that, of course, just is, we start to see the hints of the incarnation in the Hebrew scriptures and in the Greek philosophers as well. So this logos, especially if we remember it also can mean something like wisdom, then we start to see the Hebrew precedents as well.
Right.
So that's one topic that you brought up that I think was really important. I also just wanted to mention the idea of language and logic. Of course, that's something that Wittgenstein talks about a lot,
Exactly.
and I don't want for him to hijack our conversation, of course. Um, and of course, anything that I could say about Wittgenstein would be debatable and contestable because he's a little bit difficult to get your hands around. But I do think it's just kind of an interesting thing to point out when you talked about we can't have logic or reason without language. Um, maybe, but at the same time, I think it's really important to remember what would language be without logic and reason? It would be nothing without those things too. It'd be babbling or nonsense. So you do need, and that's where the kind of the organizing principle idea comes in, because but then of course all of those things, and that's what makes the concept of logos so impressive and important, is it encapsulates all of those things. It is not just language, but it's also the logic that formulates the language. And it's not just the logic and the language, but it's also the conversation, the discourse. It's the discussion also. It's the back and forth. So there's even perhaps a piece of dialectic idea in the logos. It's not necessarily just language, but it's also conversation. I think you could see even perhaps in some uses of the word logos, kind of this idea of community and discussion and conversation.
Right. No, I would absolutely agree with that. And I think just that that is so embedded within the Western mind that you see it within our justice system, I mean, like we're creating a podcast. I mean, this whole idea of then having a dialogue and then somehow reason and logic emerges from the discussion. I mean, this is a very Christian idea. And I mean, not necessarily because the Logos theology preexisted Christianity, but Christianity tried to crystallize this and really articulate it as a thing of worship, which is unique. I mean, I think so. I mean, I mentioned in kind of the intro video to this channel that all these religious traditions have a central focus, and whether it be the submission to God in Islam, or non-attachment mindfulness in Buddhism, or upholding the law in Judaism, or puja and devotion in Hinduism, going with the way in Taoism. But Christianity has this idea of a divine human. I mean, this is also in Hinduism. You have avatars and stuff, but God as human, but God as logos, and so then God as human is the incarnation of logos, and logos is how He created the world, speaking it into existence. And then for me, that connects then with these theories of magic and ritual. And I think it's so interesting when I talk to people, whether they be in the psychedelic community or just spiritual, how they believe magic is real, but then they don't understand how, if magic is real, then these other understandings of language and logos, then that has to be real, right? Not necessarily you have to be Christian or anything like that, but you have to recognize that somehow language is this supernatural power that humans have, which essentially make us human, differentiate us from animals, but also allow us to affect the world. And anyways, yeah, that's kind of what I think about that.